welcome everyone. Good morning. Hope you had fun bowling last night. But we're pleased to have with us this morning Len Sinclair. Len is Group Head of Operational Risk at Barclays Bank. He joined the bank in 2013. That makes it 4 years, Len, reporting to the Group Chief Risk Officer, and really there to transform the operational risk function. Len has extensive experience in the financial services industry, both as a practitioner and a management consultant, leading and managing complex change in banking and insurance. After graduating from Lancaster University, Len joined Barclays, in fact, in their graduate program, training through their credit program as a credit analyst, worked in operations, relationship banking, and also on project delivery. But in between, then and now, Len has worked with PricewaterhouseCoopers as a partner, working with corporate and private equity clients, specializing in operational due diligence, as well as merger integration and disposals. And then he spent some time at RBS Group, and years accountable for the delivery of your Basel II credit risk system. And then as a partner at KPMG in their operational transformation practice. So some little-known facts about Len. When he was just starting his career at Barclays and credit, those of us from credit and market risk, we often don't admit where we came from because they might say, "Oh no, it's an analytic background. We have other purposes for you." But he really worked to think about the analytics behind the credit relationship, and in fact developed the first SME, small medium-sized enterprise credit scoring algorithm, only to have it rejected by his senior management, saying, "No way will we ever lend based on some scorecard. This is all about relationship," right? Exactly. So, imagine as a young graduate, your first work rejected, but you plowed on, right? And today, Len, proud father of 4 sons. You described them as all bigger and
more handsome.
More handsome
Smarter.
than you.
And hopefully more successful.
Okay, and hopefully more successful. But apparently, it was when Len presented, we were doing a chat like this 2 years ago, and there was a video being made, and one of the sons viewed the video and came back saying, "Dad, is that what you do? Is that true?" And he also said, the moderator asked everyone to introduce themselves, and he said, "Just take a minute." And Dad, you were in 58 seconds. Everyone else took over 2 minutes. So I guess then it was an appreciation for your pithy style. So.
Exactly.
But thank you very much for being here. So, we wanted Len to talk a little bit about the project at Barclays, but more than just a systems project, what's being done to transform the organization. Len, if you could just talk about, kind of from an organizational perspective, the changes you've seen, and what do you believe there's a trend towards greater alignment across the second line functions like operational risk, compliance management, finance?
I think the answer is yes, but I'll kind of give a bit more depth than that. For those of you who may not understand the scale and breadth of the bank, everyone's heard of Barclays. We're 327 years old, I think, this year, so we've been around a while, and it feels sometimes some of the processes and people have been around that long. And as you might imagine, in such a large, complex organisation, it's very hard to get things to change. The last 15 years, I left the bank first time around in 1998 and came back again 4 years ago. And it's been through at least 2 transformations or 3 transformations in the time that I was away. In the 4 years I've been there, we've reorganised probably at least twice significantly and changed our business unit structure. So I'm sure most of you will be familiar with that scale of organisational change and construct. And in the meanwhile, the risk function, the compliance function, the audit function have to keep the wheels turning and keep in control. I think we had quite a fragmentation of second and third line responsibilities 4 or 5 years ago, and we've started to see a greater degree of alignment in the last 2 years or so, partly as a result of organisational change, and partly as a result of people realising that many of the processes are actually similar, and much of the data is very similar as well. And some of the work we've done with the MetricStream application has been helpful in that, particularly around things like issue management and risk assessment.
Mm-hmm. Good, good. So it's not necessarily kind of integration of organizations, it's more the collaboration that's naturally arising from a system. Yeah. And how would you describe, the features that distinguish today the role of a first line versus second line challenger, in the operational risk function?
We've had a bit of a sea change. We had a new chief risk officer arrive around 2 years ago, and he had a different view of the differentiation between first and second line than we'd had previously. It's fair to say that our enterprise risk management framework had been structured primarily on activity, so depending on what you did, depending on where you fitted in first or second line. From January this year, we changed that quite significantly, and now effectively second line is risk and compliance only. Anything else is either audit in the third line or it's first line. And that's given some quite good clarity to the business. There had been a fair amount of noise, particularly in the size and complexity of the business, about people understanding whether they were first or second line, and trying to explain an activity-based model can be quite difficult. Whereas now it's really straightforward. If you're in risk, or you've got risk in your job title, you're second line. If you're compliance, you're second line. If you're not in audit, then you must be in the first line. So it's quite straightforward. That also had some quite significant changes in the way we organise our policies. So previous to the beginning of this year, as head of op risk, I would own all of our risk frameworks and policies, but that included not just things like issue management and capital and RCSA, but also included things like tech policy, information risk policy, fraud policy, legal tax policy. All those policies would be owned by me and my team. As part of the split between first and second line, all of the non-risk management policies have moved to the first line. So they're now owned by the business rather than owned by risk. And that's been quite a big sea change in the organisation. And it's to get responsibility for the risk structures into the people who actually manage the risk day to day.
Right. And so, for example, an IT policy or a legal policy, that would now reside with ownership in the business.
Correct.
And then is it subject to any kind of review or
yes,
approval?
I have a right of veto.
Okay.
So I still have to review them all and understand them. But the second line's job is to review and challenge them. The first line's job is to define the technical risk policies that they need to manage their business.
Okay. And then the maintenance of that policy and everything, first line.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah. Okay, good. And then describe how you're working with other functional areas. You've described, for example, compliance as another second line function, and then audit in the third line.
Yes, we have. It's probably helpful to give a little bit of background. When we started off the program around op risk, I was actually brought in to help manage that program. That was the rationale for recruiting me, given my change background. And it's fair to say that the situation then was typical of lots of parts of the bank, where we had multiple frameworks. So each division had its own op risk framework. There were multiple policies. We had 3 versions of our previous op risk system operating in different parts of the group. There was no real data integration. There was no real reporting integration. And therefore, it wasn't the Wild West. It was far more structured than that. But nonetheless, it was quite ill-disciplined and fragmented. And so when we started to look at how we were going to structure op risk, the vision thing was probably the first thing to get right. And that was to move away from an idea that op risk was around defining technical tools and frameworks and policies. It was much more about how do we get the businesses to better understand, manage and measure their operational risk. So it was how do we make things useful. And I think that's pretty similar with where compliance and audit are trying to get to too. So getting commonality around issues, getting commonality around reporting, getting commonality around risk assessments was really important. Lining up things like scenarios across the lines of defence was really important. And also on things like capital, getting people lined up. Because if we're an AMA bank, I think we're still the only AMA bank in the UK domiciled here. We have a capital model. It's no secret that the primary driver of a lot of the capital is historical conduct risk losses. Getting alignment across risk, audit and compliance around understanding the drivers of that and the history is really important. So we do work quite closely with the other functions.
Okay, good. And then now the functions that are considered first line, so things like third-party management, IT, HR, legal. Is the relationship more of just that challenge relationship of the policies, or do you intersect in any other ways?
We have teams of specialists aligned to each of our key risks. So we have and we have had for quite some time, a common risk taxonomy. So, it's been reasonably stable in the last 4 or 5 years. Each risk has its own mini framework within the op risk framework. It has its own policies. Within the second line, we have functional specialists. So for supplier risk, for technology risk, for information risk, for cyber, for execution risk, for financial risks. Mm-hmm. We have people within my team who have deep technical expertise in those areas, and their job is primarily to review and challenge both policy as well as performance. So they'll review risk assessments, they'll review risk events, they'll review MI data, and they'll challenge the business in terms of what the business are doing around the risk profile.
Okay, great. And then, just the question of, now with the clearer lines being drawn between the first, second, and third line of defense, where are the areas where we should seek alignment? You've talked about policy, and the taxonomy.
I think although we have different functions, our enterprise risk management framework makes it very clear that all risk types have operational risk in them. So whether it's credit risk, market risk, legal risk, compliance, conduct risk, op risk, there are operational risks, and therefore all those risks are still subject to the op risk framework, which means that all of the structures around risk and control assessments, risk event management, issue management, scenarios are all run across all of the risk of the bank. And that means we have to collaborate. It's very difficult not to collaborate when you have to produce risk and control assessments that cover the entirety of the risk profile of the bank. So it does encourage people to behave in the right way.
Okay, great. So what I've heard is, around the policy, the framework for kind of managing, the functions and the first line of defense, the taxonomy, the impact scales we talked a little bit about, and then the issues.
The other big change came through our framework team. In reality was about getting common assessment. So how do you scale across a bank our size the relative importance of risks and issues? And we produced what not helpfully is called the risk and issue classification matrix, which effectively gives everyone a common standard for assessing materiality. Because audit, compliance, legal, risk and credit all use the same matrix, when looking at an issue, we can scale it appropriately and make sure it's treated consistently. Right. Getting that done was quite difficult, but we were really helped there by audit, who started to use it for all their audit findings. And once management realised that was the way audit were going to assess the materiality of audit issues, it was very easy for them to fall into line across everything else, so they had some consistency. Right. And that was quite a big step forward. We did that very early on, in fact, way before we implemented the MSI system, probably about a year before, we started to get people thinking about how to scale materiality, and that's been really helpful.
And imagine being able to go to the management and the board and, kind of high means high everywhere, right? Red is red.
In fact, the framework team are currently doing a review of it because it tries to balance both financial and non-financial assessments. The financial ones are relatively straightforward. We've got a set of thresholds that trigger different action at different levels and different escalation. The non-financial ones are more problematical and are probably triggering too many higher level issues because it's more subjective, and we're trying to play with the tuning of that. But on the other hand, it allows the board to have a pretty good view over time of the number of critical issues, number of major issues, number of limited issues. Right. What does that tell you about the health of the risk and control environment? And just the movement, year on year, the mix between the three categories, they can get a real picture as to how they think the health of the risk and control environment is. Right.
And when you talk about qualitative factors, you're talking about things like reputation,
impact
conduct
on customers, impact on staff, impact on brand and reputation, impact on regulators. The regulatory one is probably the most sensitive because we have a large number of regulators across the globe. Not all regulatory issues are equal in impact. Right. Although if you work in compliance, the answer is they're all critical. And getting some balance to the scaling of those has been probably one of the interesting challenges.
Okay, great. I just wanted to highlight as well, I have colleagues around the room with some microphones. We'd love to take your questions now and through the end of this session. It's a great opportunity to learn some lessons from Len. So, but just that's been a great backdrop in terms of kind of the setting for managing risk at Barclays. Can you talk about some of the operational risk management challenges, both at Barclays and then what you're seeing in the industry as well?
I think the backdrop clearly is regulation. We're all subject to incredibly large amounts of regulation, and it's fair to say it doesn't seem to be getting any less. And that obviously acts as quite an important backstop to the function. I think that the other big issue is organisational. I mentioned earlier on, we're a large, complex organisation. When our op-risk transformation journey started in 2012, 2013, there were 145,000 people in the bank, split across 60 countries, predominantly in US, UK, and Africa. That's the kind of nexus of the organisation. But nonetheless, 12 countries in Africa, big operation in the US, big investment bank, cards business, retail bank. So we covered the whole gamut of customers and products. We had a pretty non-standard environment, multiple processes, multiple systems, multiple policies. And really what drove the thinking behind our approach was around standardisation. And that wasn't terribly popular in an organisation as large and complex as the bank. Telling people it's one size fits all is never a very welcome message, because the bottom line is no one ever gets what they want, and everything's a compromise, and that's very, very difficult to manage. Straightforward from a programme point of view in some ways, because you are producing one set of outputs. From a business selling point of view, it's quite difficult because everyone is having to make some form of compromise. And that was quite a big challenge in terms of the transformation. So our mantra was very simple. I mentioned we want op-risk tools and frameworks that were easy to use and effectively help management better manage their risk profile. So we started off with let's standardise, let's centralise, and let's automate. The standardisation was probably the most straightforward. We simply rewrote our frameworks and policies and said, here it is, I own them. Then we drove them out. That probably underestimates the amount of physical heavy lifting involved, but nonetheless, that was actually the easiest bit of the exercise. Previously, all of the reporting lines of the op-risk teams had been fragmented around the group. Overnight, we changed that. All of op-risk function group-wide reported to me. We had reporting teams in several different places. We had framework teams in different places. So we spent a little while synthesising and organising that into a better structure. Interestingly, in the early part of this year, we then decentralised a big chunk of the team back into the businesses. Why? We've got one system, we've got one set of processes, and we've got one set of policies. It makes it much easier to drive and manage the architecture. So whether the teams report to me or report to the chief risk officer in the business, it makes very little difference.
Right. Because
I own the system, I own the data, and I still own the reporting team. So it makes it straightforward to manage. And then the automation. So we implemented one system. We had 3 versions of IBM Opus as our previous system. It's very interesting. When you try and implement a new system, it's amazing how many people say they love the old one. I was very fortunate that the program director who led the implementation of our MetricStream implementation had actually implemented the IBM Opus system in the investment bank. And we were doing a post-live review with many of the users, and we were listing down all the feedback and all the issues they had. And she then produced a presentation from 3 years previously where on the implementation of IBM Opus in the investment bank, they'd come up with exactly the same whinges and issues on that system, which they now said they loved and was the best thing they'd ever seen. So it was a very important lesson in terms of driving through change, that people just don't like change.
They just don't like it.
And they're comfortable with what they like. But the standardisation and driving through common platform and common reporting was probably the biggest transformation across the organisation.
And with that kind of behind you now in terms of standardizing policy, framework, issues, impact scales, and so on, what today are some of the challenges you're seeing in operational risk?
You could band them under the culture banner. The problem with op-risk systems is for the majority of people who use them, they're not used intraday. So, if you think about issue management, an individual might have one issue a week or one issue a month or sometimes one issue a year. Therefore, they don't get the degree of familiarity with a system that, let's take the other extreme, people would have with Microsoft Office, where they're dealing with emails day in and day out. I think we underestimated the change impact of having a system with a large number of relatively infrequent users. There are a population of super users, people who use it day in and day out, but that's a relatively small number of people in the bank. Tend to be first-line controls people or second-line people. For the vast majority of people who have to do risk and control assessments or issue management or risk event management, they're not frequent users of the system. And I think, we're spending a lot of time now on improving the user experience and the communication around the tool so that people can get more familiar with it. Because people tend not to like what they don't know. And therefore, getting people comfortable is as much a part of getting the system in as it is getting the functionality right. That's been a big focus. Reporting, we've done a huge amount of work synthesizing our reporting. And most of our op risk reporting is now standardized and automated. We have a relatively small reporting team who manage the flow for us. But what that means is people can firstly trust the data. We've done a lot of work in op risk around BCBS 239 to make sure that our data lineage and the data quality is up to scratch. And that's been a big step forward. Standardizing reporting has cut a lot of cost. We've significantly reduced the cost of reporting. And also in reporting stuff to the board, we can give the board a lot more confidence that we understand our lost data history and our risk event and issue data in a way that we couldn't before.
Right. It's an interesting topic, the one around the first line of defense and those infrequent users, and how do we give them comfort in using a system when they're used to tools like Outlook or Word and Excel. So what are some lessons learned? Is it all just training, or?
Well, a bit. I think where we made a decision at the outset, partly because we were constrained by time and cost and resource, that we do train the trainer. So as we were launching the various releases of the system, we invested a lot of time in training super users. And the aim was to then cascade their training out. It worked, but it wasn't anywhere near as effective as it should have been, partly because we didn't invest enough time in training enough people to do that. And we should have spent more time on training out into the broader user community. So if I was having my time over again, I would spend more time and money on training.
Okay, not just train the trainer, but going into the end user.
Another level down.
Okay, terrific.
It's been not an expensive lesson, it's been an important lesson, because it's a bit like driving an unfamiliar car. If you've only ever driven an automatic and someone gives you a stick shift to drive, you feel uncomfortable driving it.
Right.
And I think it's the same with an unfamiliar system. We want people to feel comfortable raising issues, raising risk events and doing their RCSAs. Getting them comfortable with the system is actually quite difficult given the size of the population and the infrequency of use.
Okay, great. So, you mentioned, the fact that regulations haven't seemed to lessen, and, we continue to see our challenges from the regulators. And a lot of their guidance isn't necessarily written, right? It might just be comments that are made in meetings and so on. So, can you talk about some of the challenges in meeting regulator requirements? And one of the things we've talked about is kind of a process-centric view of risk assessment or, lost data capture.
Yes.
Right?
I think one of the challenges is that if you're a regulator, you want to raise the bar, so you want to improve standards. And therefore, I speak to people, and my team speak to people in other banks, and we all ask the regulator, kind of, where's the bar? And the bar seems to be moving upwards at ever-increasing rate of knots, and therefore it's very hard to catch up. And then you find another bank say, we were talking to the regulator, and they think what you do in this area is really setting the standard. And you think, well, they told us it wasn't good enough. And so there's this constant, where are we? And I think that's quite difficult. Fundamentally, we have a philosophy in the risk function that we manage risk for the benefit of all our stakeholders. And whilst the regulators are important, we shouldn't be doing things purely for the regulator. Because there is an almost instinctive reaction, particularly to get priority on funding or to get people's attention. The regulator requires, I'm sure they do, but as you say, a lot of it's not written down. we're trying to get into what do management need? How are we running our business? And is it appropriate? And are we in control? And I think the sensible view that comes from our Group Executive Committee, and certainly from our Chief Risk Officer, is if we do the right thing and it's right for the business, it'll meet the regulatory requirement.
Right.
And trying to get that mindset is quite an important step. And so go right back to basics. Why do we do what we do in op risk? It's to help management better manage their operational risks. It's not about meeting regulatory requirements. It's not about having a fantastic framework. It's not about having shiny policy. It's outcome based. It's do we understand the risk profile of the business, and are we taking the steps needed to manage within our risk appetite and our risk tolerance?
Yeah.
That's fundamentally what drives the behaviour. And what we want is for management to own that, not for the second line to own it. That's probably an ongoing challenge in terms of culture, but then that's always going to be the case because people feel more in tune with control management than with risk management because they tend to get beaten up if their controls aren't good. But we've made huge strides in the last 6-7 years in that respect, and I think management do get the importance of operational risk and also the importance of having the right structure and discipline in place around their operational risks.
Right. And can you talk a little bit about how the regulator view of, taking a process-centric approach versus an organization approach to risk assessment?
We revamped our RCSAs in 2015, and we deliberately went up a level. So we were looking at, it's hard to describe given the complexity of our structure, but probably business unit X (-2) to get a holistic view across the organisation. But we drove the RCSA by organisational node, and that worked. That was for then a comfortable level. So we've done 2 runs through of that, 15 and 16. In 17, we took a different view and said, right, we need to get more process-centric because with structural reform, our organisational structure is changing. We have quite a significant centralised ops and tech capability and service company, which reflect the requirements of structural reform. And therefore, most of the businesses manage some of their processes, but a lot of their processes are managed on their behalf by other parts of the organisation. So internal outsourcing. So what we've done is started to look at our RCSAs end-to-end in process terms, and we've made some big steps this year. Next year, we're going to take that a lot further. Although we're still not, in the way some banks are, managed by process. We don't have a detailed process architecture at really micro level that we manage to. I think most banks who've tried that drown in the detail and end up giving up because of the cost of maintaining it.
Right.
But we do have a common process architecture that we use. It allows us to have conversations across businesses and across business lines. But I think more importantly, it allows people to focus on those processes and controls that they manage, but also, particularly under the senior management regime in the UK, to have line of sight on those processes that are managed on their behalf and the controls managed on their behalf in other parts of the organisation. And it then gives us a process view of inherent risk and residual risk.
Yeah, and what does that do to the ownership of risk when, someone's now looking outside their organization, taking an end-to-end process view, and it might be operations centers, even third parties, that they're now evaluating?
Correct. You have to be a little bit careful in that you still want the organisational businesses to own their risk end-to-end because it's their business. So I think it's more getting the bifurcation between impacted area and causal area. So we've spent a lot of time helping management understand the difference and think through, you may own the risk in the first line in the front office, but actually the impact of issues is
downstream. Right.
And that sounds relatively straightforward, and obviously intellectually it is very straightforward. In practice, it's more difficult to drive. Yeah. And so we've done a lot this year to move that along, and I think next year we'll be a lot further down the track.
Okay, terrific. But one thing I'm hearing is it's ever adapting, right? And it might be from a regulator guidance. It could be, just the way management is changing its view of the ownership.
And the business is changing. I mentioned earlier on reorganisation. Our business morphs in response to the markets in which we operate. And, we've had structural reform this year. That's been a huge impact on how we organise and structure things, and risk has to respond or even anticipate some of that. So how we organise and how we structure ourselves and how we report has to reflect the way the business is being run and managed. given the amount of regulation, not just in risk, but in other parts of the organisation, again, that has quite big impacts across the organisation. So, you know, I keep thinking after more than 30 years in the industry, we can't possibly get more change, and every year we get more and more change.
Yes, yeah. And then, you know, Len, from an IT system perspective and kind of the architecture that's been created for operational risk, where do you think the organization, how would you describe where the organization is today versus where you're going?
We're in an interesting time. Again, partly as a result of some other reorganisations. We're looking across risk, finance, control, compliance, and taking a much more holistic view of architecture and investment. So the head of our systems and reporting team, who actually managed the implementation of the MSI product for us in the bank, is now looking across all those areas in terms of risk and control to bring together not just system investment, but also driving towards a kind of a common platform, a common set of processes, because it's more effective and efficient, not just from a budget and financial point of view, but from an information flow point of view. You know, people want the same data on the same issues. Right. They want to understand what the risk profile is. So getting reporting aligned is really important. Right. And, you know, as most banks, we probably have a disproportionate number of people across the organisation involved in reporting in one way, shape or form. We don't want people manipulating the data, we want them manipulating the analysis. Right. And getting people into thinking rather than processing is a big step, and that's a big part of what we're doing. Right. And so from a systems perspective, you know, we've talked about, you know, alignment, you know, around issue management, and now you're talking about kind of risk and controls as well. By the end of January, we'll have one issue management system group-wide. We'll have one set of actions group-wide for compliance and for audit and for risk. We've already got one risk and control self-assessment process across the functions and across the business. So we are slowly standardising to make sure that we can control the quality of the information and the quality of the processes. And so management get a view of the entirety of the issue population, for example. Not just the ones that are at risk, not just the ones that are compliance, not just the ones that relate to regulators, but they get a complete population all through the standard matrix, so they can scale them and understand how big are our control problems or not, or are they changing. Right. And in terms of control management, you know, it's an area where an organization is probably the most mature, you know, in terms of ownership of those controls. Yet, you know, the inventory of those controls, whether they're IT or, you know, business kind of operating controls or SOX financial controls, has been challenging across the board, I'd say, across organizations. I think so. And I think part of that's historic, and part of it is a result of fragmentation of the business and fragmentation of systems. So we've got multiple systems that aren't necessarily or weren't necessarily well glued together in architectural terms. So you end up with multiple solutions for doing the same thing. We've spent probably the last 2 or 3 years as an organisation synthesising the application architecture in a much more coherent way, and that's been a significant step forward. Right. That obviously has implications for risk too, huge implications for reporting as well, which is something I keep coming back to, because fundamentally all roads lead back to IT and data, and getting those two things right are really important. So if you look at controls in particular, multiple control systems, multiple control definitions, many manual controls, there's been a huge set of activity over the last 2 or 3 years to automate large numbers of those controls and to synthesize. So have fewer controls but be more controlled. Far more preventative controls. Again, history of if there's a problem, people impose direct detective controls rather than preventative controls. We've been washing through that and improving that. And again, the landscape, and that's much, much better. Right. But I think one of the most difficult things is, you know, the ownership of those controls, but then capturing, as you said, the attributes of those controls and then doing the analysis to give information back about. Well, I think part of the change in the last 2 years, the bank set up a group chief controls office in the first line. And they own the bank's control framework, they own the definitions of controls, and they own a lot of the first line risk policies. So they're going through a process of cleaning up the controls landscape. So it's getting done in a very structured and disciplined way to make sure that the controls are architecturally sound, hierarchical, and fit together as part of a policy rather than be random responses to specific issues.
Right, and then right-sized, right?
Correct.
You know, given the risk levels, you know, what is the appropriate level of control, you know, and what's the right investment?
And getting risk acceptance understood better has been quite a big step forward. Much of the control work was about risk avoidance.
Right.
Or prevention rather than risk management. And I think where the Chief Control Officer's helped has been to get some balance between what we're prepared to accept and what tolerance levels we have, as opposed to let's put controls in to stop anything from happening.
Exactly.
Which tends to be a natural management reaction when something's going wrong.
Right, right. Okay, good. So we're still looking for hands, and I'll have, oh, good, great. Why don't we go to the middle of the room? We're coming with a mic. So can you raise your hand again? Just, thank you.
Yes, David Paris with Cognizant. What types of either seismic or subtle changes may have taken place in your op risk framework and standards as a result of resolution recovery planning and ring fencing?
I suppose it's fair to say that the primary seismic change has been the organisation structure of the bank. So the whole ring fencing organisation, and if we start at the top, you know, each of our core, we were never really organised managerially by a legal entity. We had a much more management-driven organisation. Structural reform has changed that, and we now have a legal entity structure where we have companies with their own boards, with their own chief risk officer, with their own operation risk director. Now, we still have common frameworks, but clearly each legal entity has to look at that framework, not just in the context of the group, but also in the context of its own directors and their responsibilities. So by and large, I'd say 95% of the frameworks are exactly the same, but around governance in particular, around escalation and around limits, that there are differences, and we deal with that through an agreed protocol. I think from a management governance point of view, we're probably more disciplined around our risk and control committee structures as a result, and the escalation of things to the chief risk officer, the group-wide risk committee, and the board, again, is probably more disciplined than it was. It was pretty good, but the legal entity structure tends to bring a lot more formality to some of that. The reporting lines for me personally, as I mentioned, changed. I report to the Group Chief Risk Officer, but the business partners and the operational risk directors and the businesses report to the BU Chief Risk Officer, so who are my peers at the Group Risk Committee. So from a formal reporting line point of view, they're domiciled in the legal entity. Clearly, we speak daily or every other day, and we have regular catch-up sessions on op risk-specific issues and on risk events and stuff. But again, the reporting line structure reflects the legal entity makeup rather than managerially the way you might want to do things. I think it works, though, because we make it work. So I think there's that. I think from a policy point of view, I don't think the recovery and resolution has made a tremendous difference to policy, because we were fairly well advanced both in our taxonomy and our policies anyway. We'd completely revamped all of our key risk policies through 13, 14 and 15 in the knowledge of what the landscape was like to look like, and therefore it was part of an evolution rather than any revolution. Metrics, we were running by risk and by business anyway. We've had a bit of data cleanup to do to reflect in the op risk system the allocation of historic events. Capital model we had to change, but again, all this stuff is what I'd consider to be evolutionary rather than revolutionary.
Thank you. We had another hand, yeah.
Thank you. How do you meaningfully define risk acceptance, risk appetite in a way that the first line understands it? So it's not a audit or risk or compliance language, but something that actually makes sense to first line management.
That's a really good question, because we have an obsession with checkers not checking other checkers. And I think partly it's to do with the experience of the team and partly to do with their attitude. So if I look at my op risk business partner team and the key risk experts, I was going to say they're all very experienced. That makes them sound really old, but they've all been around quite some time. And therefore, they've grown with the organisation and they've grown with the way we've changed the function. It means they know a lot about the business, which I think you can't overemphasise how important it is to understand the mechanics of mortgage processing or FX processing or whatever it is you happen to be doing. I think they all understand op risk, but they all understand its limitations, and we don't try and use the frameworks and policies as a doctrine. I think the technique is more, and we've done a lot of training with the team on personal skills as opposed to technical skills. It's largely around testing assumptions. And the way I try and describe it to the board is, I'm not bothered by what decisions management make. That's what they paid the big bucks for. They can take whatever risk they're happy to take within the board limits. What I really want is to make sure they understand the risk that they're taking. Mm-hmm. And we draw the distinction between explicit assumptions and implicit assumptions. If I give you a good example, I know you heard about Brexit yesterday. If you go back to the Brexit referendum and you did a straw poll on the day of the referendum, probably 95% of the people in the banking industry would have said it was going to be an in vote, not an out vote. Fair enough. That was probably my view, that's where we'd end. My job was to be contrarian and say, okay, if it's an out vote, are you ready? Have you understood the risks that apply to an out vote? Most of them weren't actually op risk. They were market and credit risk as opposed to op risk. But nonetheless, can you challenge the assumptions, the implicit assumptions that people have made about the outcome? And we had a contingency plan and all that kind of good stuff. Mm. But it's to question management to say, have you actually done a proper, that sounds condescending. Have you really thought through the breadth and depth of the issue? And if you have, and you've come to the conclusion, that's fine, that's what you paid for. But the challenge is around the power of their thinking. What risk assessment have you done? Is it sensible? Is it broad enough? And if it is, fine, then make your decision. And we find that works. And generally, because people are busy, there's always wrinkles they haven't thought about. And again, go back to the experience. Because our people understand the business, understand op risk, and understand processes, they can always ask questions people can't answer in a nice way, not in a catch-out way, but to get people to think. And I think the skill is to get people to think.
Thank you. Great. I see a question in the back, white jacket. Yeah.
Visa from Central Bank of Malaysia. We were talking about the ever-changing operating environment, and given that new threats are emerging every day, how do you keep tabs of these new issues? And do you have any programs that you have in your institution to monitor any emerging operational risk? And if so, how fast do you escalate and cascade the issues? Thanks.
I think I have a director in my team who spends his life thinking about regulation and helping me deal with the demands of the regulator. He's extremely experienced and keeps me safe. I think it's important to keep on top of that, and we try and preempt through our discussions with the regulator, understanding what's coming down the track. So, for instance, there was a EBA consultation paper produced last week on ICAP, which was quite fundamental, and probably for the first time laid out in quite some detail what the expectations are around ICAP. We've got a whole range of ICAPs to do in the first part of next year. He's already talking to the regulator saying we're going to take the consultation and use as much of that as we can this year, so getting on the front foot with the regulator. From an emerging risk point of view, we do have a fairly structured process, although most of these things move at quite glacial speed. It's not a monthly, quarterly process. We work close with ORX. We find their process is quite helpful to look at the risk profile. We've been a member of ORX for a long time, and we find the sharing of information around the emerging risk is quite helpful because different banks have different views. We have a structured process. We look at risk events. We look at the output of our RCSAs. We have a strategic risk assessment exercise that the businesses do as part of their medium-term planning. We synthesize all that together. We then get all of our op risk directors in a room and we debate it. We chew it over and we try and balance different views in terms of priority. So it's a fairly discursive process with some inputs, factual inputs. But at the end of the day, that kind of stuff's judgment.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you. And then, Len, in our last few minutes, we'll have other questions from the group. But can you just leave us with some successes and lessons learned? I know it's been a journey. What's worked? What are your learnings? What are some best practices you'd prescribe?
Yes.
Yeah.
I've spent the last 26 years running projects in one way, shape or form. And probably the largest would have been the RBS Basel II program, which was 80 concurrent projects and probably 350 million of IT investment. So it was a pretty meaty exercise. The exercise we did not risk, I think, was harder to manage.
Just because of the impact?
Much smaller. Yeah, it was a much smaller project. One system, 3 releases, 4 releases plus the updates, much more complex. Partly because of where the organisation was, partly because of getting a balance between standardisation and flexibility, and we made a number of mistakes trying to architect stuff too smartly and rather than be more brutal about what we were trying to do. We tried to do things probably too quickly, although we got it done. It was pretty traumatic for a lot of those involved. We had a fair number of personnel changes and finally found a program director who could deliver the program the way we wanted it, and she made a huge difference to the success of the program. I think part of the problem with OpRisk is the number of experts we have, and like most organisations, when you get lots of experts together, they've got lots of points of view. When I joined the firm, I didn't have any background in OpRisk at all, and therefore it was very hard for me to give guidance on technical content. I think if we were doing it now, I'd be more in tune with where I could take shortcuts and where I could make standardisation decisions than I could then. So I think, we ended up doing a lot of debate. Training I mentioned. Training was a big issue. More budget would have helped. We tried to do things too cheaply, and that cost us stuff. And data quality, I don't think I'd realised quite the challenge we're going to have to try and get good data once we've got the system in. And even with mandatory fields and even with all the kind of tools you've got available to standardise data, we have constant issues around getting data quality. So if I give you an example, we did a release to change a optional field to a mandatory field about which control failed for a risk event. And you think that'd be really straightforward. So we did a piece of DQ analysis 2 months after change, and we found that the most popular input was a question mark.
Oh, no.
Because people couldn't be bothered to look up which control it was.
Oh, gosh.
So we've had to change that. But it's a really good example at a very, very simplistic level of the challenges when you're dealing with a 100,000 strong organisation, all of whom can access and input data. Getting consistent, good quality data is a real challenge.
And where the rebellions will occur, right?
Not because people want to rebel often, but more because they just can't be bothered or they're too busy.
Yeah. Okay, good. A final question from the audience? Yeah. Here.
Peter Wiedel from Waypoint Consulting. I would like to ask a question about leadership in a company and culture. A German survey reported that an average company has about 17% of destructive people among them. So how do you get that data, and how would you deal with that? So this actually shows how close leadership and quality of leadership is regarding risk management. Maybe those 17% destructive people who are disappointed from career, everything, they are the most dangerous for the company, or might be the most dangerous. How do you deal with such challenges?
Well, I think having a strong risk culture has to pervade the whole organisation. And I used to wonder, particularly when I was a consultant, whether one person made a difference. And I used to be quite sceptical. I've lived through several changes of top-level organisational change, and I've had to revise my opinion, actually, that one person can make a huge difference. And if you set standards and hold people to them, then providing there are consequences, my experience is you can drive the kind of culture you want. So, for example, I've always been, I was going to say flexible, that's probably the wrong word, tolerant of breaches in certain aspects. we've changed because we realised that people, if they weren't being held to account, weren't following through. And the data quality is a good example of one. Forcing through the consequences, I think, is one way you drive the right kind of risk culture, and not in a nasty way, and not in a a criminal type way. But if people understand what the standards are, they understand they're going to be held to account. My experience is people will behave the way you want them to behave, and line management will then enforce it. Where you have a problem is when people don't enforce the standards. And we've gone through a cycle of trying to drive people to enforce the standards that we put in place, and we find it works. And we've had huge churn in the organisation. I was saying to Brenda before the meeting, if I look at our top 150 people in the 4 years I've been there, we've had huge turnover. And yet, do I think the culture's been damaged in terms of our risk culture? Not at all. I think we've been, as an organisation, whether it's market risk or credit risk or op risk or conduct risk, I think we've been pretty successful at driving the kind of behaviour we want to drive, despite some of the turnover.
Okay. Thank you very much, Len. So we've covered the gamut, from alignment to what's common and where can that kind of center of excellence and control come from, but also the challenges and the accountability ultimately we have to drive. So we're very grateful you could be here this morning. Thank you,
Thanks very much.
We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.